Today's presentation, I'm going to talk about one of the more powerful aspects of ActiveDEMAND, which is the ActiveDEMAND workflow engine. So in today's presentation, I'll share a bunch of slides with you, which will sort of get through the theory of the system and the features of the system that I'm talking about today. And then after the slides, what I'll do is I'll give you a quick walkthrough of some of the nuances of using the workflow engine in ActiveDEMAND. So really, the workflow engine, like I mentioned, is one of the more powerful capabilities of ActiveDEMAND, and it's a visual builder that allows you to build logic and execute logic automatically on a specific contact based on some specific context or what a contact has done. So really it's a visual builder. It's should be quite intuitive in using the workflow and designing these things, but definitely there's some nuances that we'll cover today. So this is an example of a workflow. The workflow consists of a canvas where you design the workflow and individual workflow steps and wires that connect the different steps. And there are fundamentally 3 step types. One is a starting step, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides. Another step type is a decision. And finally, the 3rd step type is an action. Now, really, there's the wires, the canvas, the different step types, and I'll go through each of these individually. So, starting steps. This is a workflow element that is really the entrance to the workflow. So, the prospect, it's the entry point. It defines the entry point for the prospect to enter into their personal journey and progressing through the multiple steps defined in the workflow. It's easy to see inside a workflow because it has a star, and it's a case there's only one wire that leaves from it, and there's no entrance wire into the starting step either. So really it's the entrance point for a specific contact in the workflow. Now you'll see that the starting step type doesn't have some of the features that the other step types have, like for example cloning. It's very easy to clone all of the step types except for the starting step. Clearly there's only one entry point to a workflow, and you cannot delete a starting step either, whereas you can delete any other step type within a workflow. There are different types of starting steps. Really, it's the trigger condition or something like that brings the prospect or contact into the workflow. So one type of starting step is a contact history change detected. Another one is the actual contact changed. And the 3rd type is a user trigger starting step. And I'll go through each of these individually. So the first type, and this is absolutely the most common entry point for a workflow, and it is the contact history detected starting step. And if you've looked in ActiveDEMAND, any contact, there's a contact timeline, and the elements on the timeline are known as history elements. And really, whenever a prospect does something or engages with something, and there's a long list of history types, and you can look at a filter on a contact timeline to see the whole list of types. But really, anytime something appears on a contact timeline, it is really the concept of a contact history being created for that contact. And so like I say, whether they're filling out forms or following on Twitter, clicking links, visiting the website, there's lots of different contact history types. And so this starting step is definitely the most common. And the widget icon looks like this, and if you look closely you can see the 1 symbol, which we designate as some type of a signal detected, and you can sort of see here this little timeline on the icon as well. And so you'll see different types of icons because we do have specialty versions designed in the platform, like for example form submit. Really a form submit is a special case of this where the query is already built for you. In other words, somebody filled out a form. But at its core, they're all variances of this contact history starting step type. Now, it's very important where if you're just using the generic query version, which looks like this, always be cognizant of the fact that we are querying a contact history. So my recommendation here is explicitly state the history type that you're filtering on. Because if you do something like in this query, which is possible, email address exists. Really what that says is any contact history of any type that a prospect does, and if they have an email address, they're going to enter into this workflow. So definitely be careful on the queries, and there's other videos that talk about the queries, but definitely this specific entrance type or entrance step type is viewing or waiting for a contact history to be detected. And once that happens, this workflow starting step looks at the query and sees if it matches and then progresses. Now, the second type of entrance step is a contact changed. So there's really two types of data in ActiveDEMAND. One is the transactional data, which shows up on the timeline, which I just talked about. The second type of data in ActiveDEMAND is metadata. And really this is descriptive data. And so there's standard fields on contacts and organizations, and there are custom fields on contacts and organizations in ActiveDEMAND. Now, there's no history tracked when a metadata change happens. So, for example, if you change, like there's a custom field that says, favorite color, and their favorite color is red. No, it's green. I was a mistake. It was green. We don't track on the timeline changes to the contacts as history elements. So to view or monitor changes on the metadata, we have a entrance type which is called contact changed. And basically what you do is you create a query that's looking at a filter on contacts that match some specific metadata query. And basically what happens is once this query is defined, that query is executed on the database every 10 minutes. So it goes and pulls the database. Anybody that matches the query in the starting step will be pulled into this specific workflow. And this is what the icon looks like. And basically it's showing that some contact has been edited and saved. And then once we detect this, again, that brings the person into the workflow. And the third type of starting step is the user drip. And really, this type of entrance condition is manual entry, so to speak, as somebody has been pushed into the workflow by some workflow action or some user action or something like that. It's really, there is no query, it's just a bucket, and basically what happens is somehow that person has been pushed into this workflow. So for example, I could go directly to a contact and click the, add to drip campaign button on the contact profile. I could as well go to the all contact screen, filter a whole bunch of contacts, bulk edit them, and then click add to drip. And the drip campaigns that will show up are the ones that are of the type with starting step as user drip. And finally, there's also a workflow step that is called, as you see, workflow add to drip, which looks something like this, but really it's, let's say at the end of one workflow or one campaign or drip campaign, you want to manually push them into a specific drip campaign of the type user drip. Again, there is a workflow action to add people that again, match some criteria before there is a workflow element that is add to drip. So that's how we get people into the workflow. Now I'm going to talk about decisions, and this is a step type that allows us to change direction based on some specific criteria within a workflow. So really, there is the widget, the element, the decision widget. It's got an input. In other words, we're coming to a decision from some other workflow element, and then leaving it, there's a green wire with a checkbox, which we call the true path. In other words, this is the direction somebody takes if the query in the decision is true. And the second wire that comes out of it is the false path. And really, when you're building your workflows, you'll drag and drop a decision onto the canvas, and the first wire that you drag from it will be the green wire. The second wire you drag from it will be the false wire. And based on the type of decision, the false path varies on how it is actually executed, and I'll explain that. So it's really, there's three types of decisions that you can use. One is the basic decision, which I'll talk about, decision with a wait, and the final is wait for next, and I'll go through each of these decisions. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the basic decision. Now, this step type, notice there's a little bubble here, and this allows you to clone or delete specific steps, which is something you cannot do with a starting step, like I mentioned. But the basic decision is, again, there's an input wire, there's a query that you basically build the query, then the query, if it's true for that specific contact at this time, when they hit this decision, this is the path that is followed. Now, the query that shows up here, if at this specific time that the prospect hits this workflow element, if it's false at this time, this is the path that the contact will follow. So it's important. This one is a transactional element. And what I mean by that is a contact, if they hit this, it basically makes the query, and if it's true, it goes this way. If it's false, it goes this way. It is purely a pass-through. Nobody sits in this specific element waiting for something to happen. Literally, when you hit this basic decision type, it's going to look at the query. If it's true, it'll go this way. If it's false, it'll go this way. Now, the next type of decision is a decision with wait. And really, this specific decision type is, again, we have the input wire, and we do have two exits. One is a true exit, one is a false exit. So really, the difference between the basic decision and the decision with a wait is really there is a time element where we're waiting for this query to be true. So if they come in and the decision, they do the query, and it's a case that the decision is false, it will wait for and keep checking that query to see if it's true. And when it does become true, it's going to pass through. And this query checks on the workflow time scale, which is once every 10 minutes. And so basically it'll come in here. If it's false, 10 minutes later it'll check again. If it's still false and it doesn't meet the query timeout, which is defined on this wait for change step type, it'll just keep checking until it's true, and it'll go this way. Now, if there's a timeout, in other words, you define how long you will keep checking with this decision type. If that time expires, that will now move you through the false path. So the widget is always identified by this little clock. So you'll see the basic decision doesn't have a clock. The decision with a wait will have a clock. So both the basic decision and the decision with a wait they are again query-based decisions. And there's also special cases of these where we make it easy for you and we've built the query for you, like for example, email open, email link click. There is two versions of these. One of the versions is without await. The second is the version is with await. So if it doesn't have await, it's transactional. In other words, if you're using the email open decision type, there will be a little envelope here with no time, and it is transactional in nature. In other words, it'll hit it if they've opened it. When this query is made, it'll go this way. If it's false, when this decision is hit, it's going to go this way. So really, we typically use the wait for change if we are, want to give the prospect time to do something that enables them to match this query. So it's important here as well with this wait type is as soon as it detects that it is true, it moves forward. And it's only after the timeout that it moves to false. Now, the final decision type is what we call the wait for next. And really, this is a special decision that's waiting for a contact to do something specific. So if you, for example, let's say we've sent somebody an email and we want them to phone us, right? So they may have phoned us in the past, but if this query is being made, we're trying to wait for the next history element to occur. So if we're waiting for them to call at this specific juncture inside the workflow, then we would use the wait for next object and define the history query to be phone call, right? As we're waiting for a phone call, for example. So really what it does is it sits here waiting for the next history element that's defined in the query of this decision. And again, once it happens, it moves the true path, or if it times out, similar to the wait for change, it follows the negative path here. So it's again false on timeout, similar to the previous one. So, and again, if you look at the icon, it's got a clock and it's got a little, if you can see it here, a little arrow on the clock. That designates that we're waiting for something to occur in the future. Now, there's lots of different decision types, but really there's just the three that I described, which is the wait for next, and the basic query rather, the wait for change, and then the wait for next. It's these three elements here. Now, these are all just special cases of these elements. Like, for example, this is a basic decision, which is email open, which you can add a wait for. And if you do add the wait, it's going to add the clock. And then this email open decision becomes a wait for change query. Same with the email link click. Again, you can do it without a wait, or you can add the wait to it. And if there's no wait, again, just to reiterate, it is transactional. It goes directly through the campaign. I mean, through the workflow when it hits this specific query. Now, the next type of step that I'm going to talk about is the action step. So the actions are really this is where we get things done. We do things. Typically, we're doing things in a workflow that involve the contact. So it does something specific with that contact when it hits this step. And if you look at it, there's going to be an input wire. There's only going to be one input wire here. And there's going to be, well, there can be multiple depending on decisions. But with certainty, there is only one exit wire. And there's no little yes, no indicator. It is a pass through. So this is going to happen, and then there's only one path after it's been done, which is this single wire leaving the step. So it moves forward after this action has been taken. So there is really, we can think of these as typically they're transactional in nature. 90% of the the action step types are transactional, meaning you hit that workflow, it's done, it moves forward. Like, for example, I'm going to send an email. When you hit this workflow step, it's going to go configure the email, send the email, then move forward. So they're not sitting here waiting to have the email sent. Literally, they take the email, takes the email, sends the email, and moves forward in the workflow. So it is transactional in nature. The one exception to that is there's a special type of action that we call the wait action, and it sounds a little bit odd that there's a action that's called wait, but really it is an action. You enter it, and then once it's done, it moves forward. But with the wait, it's actually the case that the prospect stays at that action, waiting for the specific configured time to occur, which is the action we're taking on the contact. And then once that time has elapsed, they move forward. Now, something to note about wait action types is that in the workflow, people will bunch up in this wait and collect in this wait, and they're typically sitting around in a wait state. That's usually what contacts are doing in a workflow, is they're usually sitting around waiting for some specific time or something to occur in the middle of a workflow. Now, if you're editing the workflow and you delete a wait and it has contacts currently at that wait state, they all drop out of the campaign when you delete it. So it's important to note that. So there's lots of action types. Like there is, and really depending on the integration, this type of stuff, you'll see there are so many types of actions that could be taken within a workflow. And here's a subset of the total amount, but there is definitely a large list of actions that you can execute from within a workflow. Now, which actions are available where is really dependent on the type of an account that you have with ActiveDEMAND or the type of workflow you're using. And definitely with regards to the type of integrations you have set up in your account. Like, for example, if you're integrated with one type of CRM, you're not going to see all the actions for different types of CRMs. And if you haven't integrated a CRM, there's going to be no CRM workflow actions presented. Really go to the support portal, and there is a reference document that talks about the availability of the specific workflow actions, the context where it's available, etc. That's really your go-to as a support portal reference. Now, the final piece is really the wires, and this is what connects the individual workflow steps inside a workflow. So really what you will do is you're typically drawing wires by clicking one element and dragging and dropping on another element. Now each of the wires actually does have a property, and you can change the property. So for example, decision wires, there's a true property or a false property. So if you click on the true, you can change the true to false, and it'll change that as well as it will change the false wire to true. So you can click on wires, and you can click, if it's a decision wire like you're seeing here, you can change the state of it, or you can click on the arrow point and drag the wire from one element to another element as well. And wires can be deleted. You can just click on the wire and it'll pull out the little slider, and again you click the delete element or delete wire, and it will delete the wire between the two elements. So really that's the basics of the elements in a workflow. There's a couple of other features that are useful. For example, cloning and deleting, mass cloning, mass deleting. Really, you can just drag across a bunch of elements on the canvas, and it'll pop up this little icon here. This is there's a clone button, which will allow you to clone that group of elements, or you can click the delete button and it will delete those specific elements. I've covered now the basics of workflow editing, the different step types, the wires, the basic system of the workflow. Now I'm going to talk about workflow types, because really you'll see that the workflow editor shows up in a lot of places within the system. It's a very powerful editor, and we reuse it in lots of different contexts within the system. The first type of workflow is the lead processing workflow. The next one is autoresponder workflows, and finally you'll also see workflows show up in specific contexts of campaigns and campaign types, which I'll go through. Now I'm going to start with the lead processing workflow. And this is, and you see here in the menu, this is where it's all of the lead processing workflows are accessed from the left menu where you see automation, lead processing. Now, typically, depending on the account type you have, there will be some default workflows, lead processing workflows that show up. And if on specific account types, you can actually create custom lead processing workflows. Really, these are utility workflows that are triggered when a prospect does something. And really the idea is we're trying to adjust that contact, update that contact, or communicate internally to the employees of the account about something that just happened. Or maybe we'll be communicating with a CRM or this type of stuff. So there are the default workflows that show up in all accounts is one, the appointment processing. Actually, this only shows up in, it doesn't show up in the call tracking or the email marketing account types, but it definitely shows up in the small business marketer and corporate marketer. This is really the workflow that's shared by all appointments, and it reminds the person who booked the meeting that they booked a meeting, and reminds them to show up from the meeting. It also notifies the calendar owner that somebody booked a meeting, etc. There's also the sales lead notifications workflow. And really, this workflow is used to communicate internally when something happens. Like, for example, somebody fills out a form, we need to go tell the sales organization that somebody filled out a form. That's handled typically in the sales lead notification workflow. Phone notifications workflow, again, when an incoming phone call happens or somebody text messages the company, again, it's a workflow that's triggered. The history item that's triggered is a phone call or SMS received. And basically, again, the intent of these workflows is to communicate internally about something that has happened. Now, something to note about the lead processing workflows, and this is really, really important to understand, is that they are all triggered whenever any contact does anything. And really what I mean by that, somebody visits the website, somebody clicks a link, somebody opens an email. What happens is all of these workflows fire, and the entrance query determines whether that workflow is going to process them. So, for example, somebody books a meeting. It will fire this workflow. It will fire this workflow. It'll fire this workflow. And depending on the entrance queries on the workflows, it determines whether that workflow, that contact will actually be processed by the individual workflows. So it's really important here to understand that is that even though a contact was processed by this one, that same contact can be processed by this exact workflow with a different set of actions. And there's use cases where we'll want to do that, but note that the entrance into a specific workflow, it's not mutually exclusive. Somebody can enter one and enter the second one and enter the third one. So you have to be really careful on how you use these workflows. Now, the corporate marketer package has the ability to create custom workflows. And this is really useful, especially as your sales team gets larger or you're trying to do specific actions based on what contacts have been doing, moving them through different classifications, this type of stuff. So there are some use cases where a custom workflow is really nice. Now, it's important to note here that the lead processing workflows, there is no reporting on these workflows. They are purely utility workflows. And what I mean by no reporting, there's no email link clicks, no email opens. all of this happens on the timelines of the prospects that are being processed in these workflows, but they are purely utility workflows. In other words, you can't go in and look at attribution reporting or basic participation reporting. Really, it is just for their utility workflows. There is no reporting associated with processing in these utility workflows. Now, the next type of workflow is the autoresponder. Now, every time you create a form in our system, typically you're going to want to communicate with the prospect something to do with their form fill. So, if they fill out a form, you might want to send an email saying, hey, thanks for filling out a form, and, we'll get back to you, or whatever. At the end of the day is the base use case of every form fill is that we want to send some type of a communication to the prospect when that form is filled out. So you can access the autoresponders directly in the form editor on the autoresponder tab. So when I create a form, it will create an autoresponder, and you can configure this workflow directly in the form. All autoresponders that are created as a result of form creation will show up in the autoresponders table. So there's a shortcut that enables you to go edit a bunch of autoresponders. You cannot delete an autoresponder workflow. And why is that it's intrinsic to the actual form that it's tied to. So really it's a utility workflow that's really in the place. It's been put in place to make it quick and easy for you to build out a response to a form. Now, it's important to note, though, is that, again, this is a utility workflow, therefore there is no reporting, right? It's really just sending an email to a prospect. It is a workflow. You can take actions and decisions, etc. But I strongly recommend that you do not do any real work in an autoresponder. Why? Well, there's no reporting. Now, if you've done work in the autoresponder, there is an option in the editor to convert it to a drip campaign. And why would you do that? Well, that's the next workflow type that I'm going to talk about. And really with the campaigns, then the campaign workflows, there is a ton of reporting. That's where really we're doing the heavy lifting. So really point is it's a simple workflow editor. It allows you to do decisions, but my recommendation is do not do any real work with an autoresponder. Now, the final place you'll see the workflows is in campaigns. So there's really two types of, there's two campaign container types in our system. One is the calendar campaign type, and the other, the first one is so there's really two campaign container types. One is the calendar campaign container. The second is the workflow-based campaign container. So, of course, the workflow-based campaign containers, which are the drip campaigns, well, they're workflows, right? So it's a case that clearly the workflow engine is going to be used within the drip campaign container type. Now, there are special cases of the calendar campaigns where there are workflows that are used in the calendar campaign. And this is only in the corporate marketer, and that is done in the event campaign container type. And as well in the generic campaign container type. And really there are two types of workflow use cases in the corporate marketer. One is the event reminder workflows, which is basically a set of workflows in a calendar campaign that do post-processing of contacts based on something that they've done within that event campaign. And the other type of workflow is the scheduled workflow. In other words, the starting step is really a wait for a specific time, and then at that date and time, that workflow, that prospect proceeds through that workflow. So really, these two cases of using workflows, the important part here is that because they are campaigns, campaigns have measurement and hence campaigns have reporting. So if you're going to do any real work with a contact, really you should be doing it in a campaign because the campaign has reporting. Now I'm going to talk about some base concepts that apply to all workflows. And really, there's just some things you need to consider when using the workflow engine and using workflows. All workflows, regardless of how the workflow, where the workflow shows up, really it's processing some contact, right? So the two things that a workflow always has, it'll always have a contact and some specific context. So what I mean by the context is, for example, what brought the person into the workflow is the context that is carried throughout that workflow. So no matter where you are within a workflow, the two things that are always accessible in that workflow are the contact and the context which brought that person into the workflow. So this is really important for using dynamic fields or dynamic terms as they're called, or if we're doing queries in the decisions within the workflow. So if I talk about dynamic terms with context, for example, in an action, let's say I'm sending an email. So if somebody fills out a form and the starting step in the workflow is that form submit, throughout that workflow we have the context of the work. So throughout the entire workflow we have the context of that initial form fill. That's the session that was with the form fill, what they filled out on the form, what page that form was on. There's all kinds of elements that are associated with that contact history that triggered this specific workflow. So if we look at, for example, dynamic terms. So the dynamic terms, there's the standard global terms, and which are the standard fields and the custom fields. There's a contact that's always accessible throughout the workflow. So I can use these dynamic terms directly in an email. Now, if the context of the workflow was, for example, a form submit, I now have all of the dynamic terms associated with that form fill that are now accessible within email. So for example, submitted form values, field value pairs, all of this type of the session, all of this stuff that's associated with the context of the workflow for that contact. Anyway, that's anywhere. So at the beginning of the workflow, halfway through the workflow, 15 steps into the workflow, through that entire journey, you always have access to the context that started this prospect through the journey. Now, the second part of the workflow context that we'll be using is the query. Right? So again, the context is available to us throughout the entire workflow. So one use case is using queries to check that context. So on decisions within a workflow, you will often see this query context. And this is it's something that we put in place to simplify the query building. Why? Is that, well, if you think about it, we have transactional data and metadata. Transactional data, that's anything the prospect has done through the entire history of that prospect's life cycle up until the point of this specific decision. So for example, there's lots of things a prospect can do and will do repeatedly, like click a link. They'll click many links in their life cycle. They might fill out a whole bunch of forms, download all kinds of assets. Because it's transactional data, right? This data, we have to find some context to find the right specific history element that we're querying, right? So for example, workflow context, if we're looking at a specific, did they open an email? Did they click a link? Did they do it as a result of something that can be directly tied to this campaign? And what I mean by that is every action that happens in a workflow is like send an email or SMS somebody. The link is encoded with the workflow ID. So if we can associate with the specific history item that has the workflow ID tied to it, we can use the workflow context. So for example, did they open an email? That was sent in this workflow. That's workflow context. Now, there's also a campaign context because really it isn't just what happens in the workflow that is associated with this campaign. You can have track links, a bunch of other stuff that associates a contact, I should say this campaign to the contact. So you can change it to say, you know, did they fill out a form as a result of something that had the campaign ID associated with it. So for example, the tracked link on a Google ad. If they click the Google ad, as has the campaign context, and then they fill out the form, even though they filled out the form not as a result of sending an email, but they did it as a result, again, campaign context. We can use this context that really says, do we have a campaign history item, a campaign associated with a specific history item that we're querying? And finally, global. And really this is asking, did it ever happen, right? Did they ever fill out a form regardless of how they did it? Now, it's important to note, and I mentioned it earlier in this presentation, that metadata, there is no history associated with metadata changes. So if you change their first name or their communication preferences or their favorite color, there is no history associated with it. So really, if we're just doing pure decisions based on global metadata, the context always has to be global. So you choose the global here. And there's a whole video on queries, but really the important part here is that I'm mentioning is that throughout the campaign, throughout the workflow, the contact is accessible as well as the context of what brought this person into the workflow. So, best practices. Now, it's a powerful engine, right? And it's probably one of the most powerful pieces that ActiveDEMAND has is this workflow editor. Now, it's important to keep it simple, right? I would say one of the most important things here is start small. Don't build a massive workflow, hit go, and then start trying to figure out if it works. Really start slow and layer the workflow as you progress. Right? You don't start with something like this. Start really basic. Get a feeling for what this workflow is trying to do and test. Right? So it's easier to test with a simple workflow and then slowly layer on the complexity. Again, I'm going to echo this. Again, is that autoresponders and utility workflows, there are no reporting. So if we're talking about real work, typically you do the real work in a campaign because the campaign has reporting. And some people may be tempted to, for example, communicate internally, this type of stuff in autoresponders. Really, I highly can't stress this enough. Do not do any real work in an autoresponder. It's simple, easy, short to the point. Communicate with the prospect in the autoresponder. And why? And it's really it comes to this here next best practice, which is related to both the lead processing workflows and the autoresponder workflows. If you're going to communicate internally about anything that's happened, do not do it in a campaign. Do not do it in an autoresponder. Do it in a lead processing workflow. Specifically, I would say do it in the lead processing workflow, which I should say the sales notification workflow, which I'll talk about in just a second. And why I'm saying that is in our account at the time of recording this video, we literally have more than 600 autoresponders in our account. And we have more than 400 campaigns in our account. So if we're trying to find out, what happened with the contact and or what happened internally, how did we get this lead, etc. Going through 400 campaigns or 600 autoresponders, look, I have better things to do than doing that. Really keep it simple, focus it in the lead processing workflows. So again, another best practice about lead processing is try to keep all lead notifications in a single workflow. I know the workflow is going to get really complex, but that's fantastic because you can always backtrack and see exactly how we notified somebody or changed the state of a contact from a lead qualification perspective in that single workflow. So the sales lead notification workflow is really, the purpose of it is for designing the lead qualification and distribution process. Now, with the corporate marketer, you have control over this. Small business marketer, you do not, but the corporate marketer, it's a very powerful feature. If you looked at our lead processing workflow, it's actually crazy how complex it is, but that's beautiful in that it can be complex, right? Is we have the ability to finely tune a lead processing and lead distribution workflow is the magic here. So another best practice here is to really storyboard. Workflows are great tools for storyboarding some type of a process or a campaign. So really, I typically, when I'm trying to do a drip campaign or think about some lead processing workflow or some funnel or something like that, I just start with a storyboard. I just open a drip campaign and just start drawing. Who cares about the content? Who cares about the queries? It's really just drag and drop, build out the story. And it's a great way to sort of visualize concepts, also to collaborate with some of the other folks in your organization about concepts. But yeah, it's really just throw it on a plate, throw it on a canvas and see what it looks like. Another best practice related to this is make sure you name every single element in the workflow. Every step needs to have a unique name. And why is it makes your workflows much more readable. But two, when it comes to reporting and we're trying to understand what's been done, if you have 15 weights, they're all called weight, you never know which one a prospect is in, right? Or if you have 15 decisions all called decisions and somebody drops out of a campaign as a result of one of the decisions called decision, again, you're going to be swimming upstream without a paddle is the point. So now I'm just going to switch over and do a very quick demo to sort of show you some of the concepts with the workflow editor. So the first type of workflows I'm going to talk about are the lead processing workflows. These are the utility workflows that are used for communicating internally when prospects do stuff, post-processing prospects, reminding about appointments, this type of stuff. So the three workflows you typically see in your account by default are the sales notifications workflow, the phone notifications workflow, and if your account type supports appointment scheduling, there is an appointment processing workflow. So the most important here is actually this one, I argue, and really it's used for designing the lead qualification and distribution process. So if you have the corporate marketer account, you can edit this workflow and you can completely design what is the appropriate signal and context that signifies that a prospect, what they've done, makes them ready for sales engagement. So it's really for lead qualification and lead distribution. Typically, we're creating deals with the CRMs in this workflow. Now, if you have the corporate marketer as well, you can create other utility workflows. And all of them are based on some signal, or I should say some contact history created on a contact's timeline. They're all of the type new contact history detected. So all of these are special cases of this general query here. This one is really pre-filtered to if somebody filled out a form or registered for a webinar in this case, or added to a list, etc. So really the idea here is you create a specific utility workflow for post-processing prospects that have done something very specific. Again, these workflows, there is no reporting, so it's really about communicating or internally or post-processing prospects. Now, the next type of workflow I'm going to talk about are the autoresponders. So these, again, are intrinsically connected to specific forms. So when you create a form, every form will automatically have an autoresponder workflow associated with it. So in the form editor, you can edit this autoresponder workflow, and all of the autoresponders are exposed under this area here. And again, with this workflow type, you see the starting step. It's hard-coded to this specific form, and basically it's a case that it's the whole intent here is to communicate with the prospect that they filled out the form. We recognize that the form was filled out, etc. Now, in the corporate marketer, you can go notify sales in this workflow, but again, never do any real work or internal communications in an autoresponder workflow. And if you did do some work in here and you want to really, you need to, things got out of hand and you need to convert it into a drip campaign, there is this option on the properties inside an autoresponder to convert this as a drip campaign. So basically it'll destroy this and turn it into a drip campaign, with the starting step being a form submit. Now, the next type of workflows are the campaign-specific workflows. And again, there's two campaign container types. One is the drip campaign, and again, you see here, this is where you get all the different starting steps, whether it's the contact changed, the user drip, or the contact history detected. There are a couple of specialty cases, again, of the contact history detected, but really this defines the starting step of the drip campaign. And depending which of these you choose, there are some individual options in that type of campaign container type. Like, for example, if they're added to a list, there is an option. If they are removed from the list, do you pull them from the campaign? So each of these different starting steps does actually expose some different capabilities in the drip campaign. So if we look at this example, user drip, it's really the intent is to try to get somebody to book an appointment with the sales rep. So we add them to the user drip. It waits 2 days. We send them an email saying, hey, can you try to call you, pick a time on my appointment scheduler that's right for you. Then that email sent immediately. We go to a wait state, and really we're trying to get them to book a meeting. And if they book a meeting, it's going to automatically kick them out of this campaign if we define a goal as such. Now, if they don't book the meeting, we can say, hey, try to call me, right? Here's my phone number. And we can put in a decision step that is a wait to call me. Now, if they call, we'll assume what's done is what we needed to do, so they can just exit out of the campaign. But if they don't call, that's where this timeout happens, and then they follow through this path here. So this is an example of a user drip campaign, user drip starting step, and of course the workflow steps to process this prospect. Now I'll talk about the second campaign context where you'll see the workflow editor, and that is in the event campaign type, which is in the corporate marketer package. Really, the idea of the event campaign is it's a more complex campaign, because let's say we're trying to get somebody to register for a webinar or do some type of a sign-up thing where there is a bunch of post-processing that happens on specific dates and times. So there are two places you can see workflows executed in the event campaign type. One is at a specific date and time. So you can take and schedule a workflow to start with everybody in the campaign audience by dragging this workflow action to be started at this specific date and time. So this is the only place you're going to actually see a starting step that is a actual wait for a specific date and time. So the idea here is that you can have several workflows that will execute at a specific date and time. So this is going to execute on the entire audience at this date and time. This workflow is going to execute with the entire audience at this date and time. It's a bit of an esoteric use case, but really it's scheduled workflows. Now, there is another place you'll see in the event campaign, which are really reminder workflows or post-processing workflows. So for an example, in a webinar, we might have multiple sessions for that webinar. Now, we'll offer multiple sessions or multiple start times, but really the reminders to get somebody to actually attend the webinar, it's all relative to the specific session that they signed up for. So what we've done is abstracted the reminders into a post-processing workflow that is still part of the calendar campaign. So if we look at this workflow, you'll see here that basically it starts when somebody registers for a webinar. So when they register for the webinar, we just wait for the time that they registered for to remind them, and we're reminding them about the webinar. And then, of course, we try to send them surveys after they attended the webinar. So really, there is a nice use case for a combination of a calendar campaign and a workflow campaign. Now, arguably, we could have done a drip campaign and a calendar campaign as two separate campaigns. But really, the reason that we've combined it into a single campaign here is because there's a specific event. The specific event, we're trying to get people to register, get people to show up, etc. So if you build a recipe that has both the promotion elements and the reminder elements and workflows, there's a really nice use case for that here. So that's pretty much it. It's the workflow system in ActiveDEMAND is extremely powerful, and definitely it's going to take a little bit of time to master it, but right out of the gate you can get a lot done with the workflow engine and the basic components.